Hi, David. So great to have you here today.
Thank you, Megan. It is a pleasure to get a chance to visit with you and talk about thing that I'm sort of interested in. That's herbal medicine.
Just a little bit,
Just a
hey?
little bit, yeah.
So I like to get an idea of where everyone started their herbal journey when we start our conversations. So would you mind telling us a little bit about your path into the herbal world?
Well, it's a bit of a long story, and there's sort of several segments to it. But I'll start off by saying that um, as a very young child, I guess I would be described as what they now call neurodivergent, although those words didn't exist when I was a kid. And I didn't relate to people all that well, but I really related to rocks and plants. And I can remember, I'll call this my first herbal experience. I was in the backyard and I had this plastic tub and I was gathering this one kind of leaf. I didn't know what it was called, but I knew that the plant said that if I took the plant and put some water in there and mashed it up, I could use it on like insect bites and cuts. And my mother comes out and she looks at me and I'm mashing this plant up and I've got water in there and I'm mashing it. And I've got probably, I'm covered with it. I mean, it's like all over the place. I wasn't very neat. And she says to me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm making medicine. It's for when you have a boo boo." And she just shook her head. And I don't remember what happened after that. But now I actually know what the plant was, even though I didn't know what it was then. And it was plantain. And the plant talked to me and told me, and I never stopped listening to plants. Fast forward, I'm about 11 years old, and we never had any money. So I never like went to summer camp like other kids in the neighborhood and stuff like that. But one year I was either a Boy Scout or a Cub Scout. I think 11, probably a Cub Scout. But anyway, and they had a program where you could go to, it was sleepover camp, and it was a week. And it didn't cost much in the way of money. And so my parents decided that would be a good thing, and I was pretty excited about it. So I went to Boy Scout camp for this one week. And for the most part, I found out that Boy Scout camp was older kids mostly terrorizing younger kids. But there was one really good thing that happened while I was there. This counselor showed us this plant and gave it to us to taste. And it had this credible lemony lime flavor. And I, as a child, was never big into sweets. I like sour things. I liked to eat lemons when I was a kid. Um, and I got home and I couldn't remember what he had called it. I didn't, I couldn't remember anything but the flavor. And so this is like 1967. Yeah, about 1967, 66, somewhere around there. And so, there's no internet. There's no, if you want to learn something, you have to go to the library. And at that time, you go to the library and you get a book on edible plants. First of all, there may have been one book in the entire library on edible plants. It's not something that was popular back then. Eventually, I kept looking for this plant and I eventually discovered the name of the plant, and it was sheep sorrel. And it was the first plant that I really identified beyond, in my childhood, we would pick wild raspberries or things like that. But beyond, or, strawberries, beyond that, this was the first wild plant that I had some familiarity with and really thought it was amazing. And the idea that I could go out into the woods behind my house, into the fields, there was a farm behind my house, and find plants that were edible and or medicinal, to me was just like this aha moment. It was like, why isn't everybody into this? And I got my first book on edible plants. It was Yule Gibbons Stalking the Wild Asparagus. Very quickly, I got a second book by him called Yule Gibbons Stalking the Healthful Herbs, and I never looked back. And from the age of 13 on, I fell in love with plants. I fell in love again with this idea that there were all these incredible plants out there that could help us, that could feed us. And here we are 56 years later, and I'm just as much in love with plants today as I was then. And I'm just so thankful that I found not only my avocation, but my vocation with plants at a really young age. And of course, when I first started doing this, people would say to me, "What do you do?" And I'd say, "I'm an herbalist." And people would look at me like I just told them I was an alien from another planet. And they would just shake their heads, thinking, poor misguided youth. Why would you waste your time with something that people did 100 years ago? Nobody does that anymore. But I didn't care. I thought it was the most incredible thing, and peer pressure just didn't matter to me. And so I have had the great fortune of spending my life learning about plants, using them to help people, sharing what I've learned with other people, writing books about it. It's been marvelous.
Oh, that's lovely. I feel there's so much you said that is very relatable for anyone else on the plant path, from playing with the plants, interacting with them as a child, when we have a very different way of relating in our worlds. The child experience is very unique to our times of our life, and it was very open. And I know many folks maybe even became disconnected after childhood, but eventually found their way back to the plants. And so it's just we're so grateful to folks like you, David, for continuing that on, for making that an example for some of us coming a little later, who had some people to look up to and say, oh, there are herbalists, there are things we can do. Because I know even in my time coming up, there wasn't a lot. Then there still is not. But the more and more we are able to get that knowledge and share that and build that community, it's just such a lovely thing. Because I know those of us who are passionate about the plants are, there's nothing like finding someone else who's
Mhm.
interested in getting to share that. So it's such a lovely gift.
I would just add one thing. When I started formally studying plants in 1969, I always joke, and I'm not entirely, I'm kidding, but I'm not. I tell people all my friends were interested in one plant, and I was interested in all the other ones. That one plant is even more popular now. But the reality was there was a period of about 10 years where I believed I was the only herbalist in the entire East Coast. Now, I was wrong. There were other people, but they were mostly either in ethnic communities or rural communities and kind of hidden away. And they may have been well known within their community, but outside of their community, they were invisible. And back then, the only living herbalist that I'd ever heard of or knew was Dr. Christopher. I mean, that was it. Elsewise, it was all pretty invisible. We're talking about a time where herbal medicine was at its nadir. It was virtually extinct in the United States. So when you talk about how there's still not a lot of people, well, I'll give you just one quick example. Um, some years ago, they started this Herb Day event, and this year it was May 3rd. And a group of my students who make up the New Jersey chapter of the American Herbalist Guild had their third annual Herb Day event. 2,000 people showed up. If we had done this 10 or 15 years ago, if 200 people had showed up, we would have been thrilled. It's, as far as we can tell, the largest Herb Day event in the U.S., which is just incredible. There was at least, I didn't count exactly, but at least 80 to 100 of people who were current or former students of mine at this thing. The people who put it on are all former students of mine. So while I would agree with you, herbal medicine is still not fully appreciated for what it is and what it can do, we have come a long way.
Absolutely. It's it's just so wonderful to see more and more people getting that herbal plant connection back into their consciousness. I think it's really important for us, and so it's so great. I'm curious to hear a little more. So, as you mentioned, when you were getting started out in herbs in the late 60s, that was a pretty low time for interest and for practice of herbalists, or they were practicing in very small tight-knit communities. So I understand you were learning in the eclectic tradition, and that's something you've become quite well known for. Could you tell me a little bit about that, how you found that tradition and about what that is?
Well, in 1975, my girlfriend and I, her brother was going to school in Vermont at Goddard College, which is no longer there. It shut down about, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago. And so we went up for the weekend. We took a bus up to Vermont and hung out for the weekend in Vermont. I was living in Brooklyn, New York at the time. And in front of the school community center, there was this giant billboard with, people with had thumbtacked all sorts of announcements to it. And excuse me, one of them said book sale. And even then, I was really into books. And I have a really massive herbal library now. But even then, I was trying to learn anything I could. And as I mentioned before, it was hard. There were no herb schools at all. There were few herb books, and of course, many of them were terrible. But at the time, I didn't know very much, so I had no way of knowing whether they were good or bad. I just everything I could find, I'd buy and read and devour, and then experiment, often on myself. I liked experimenting on myself. I have some very funny stories. Anyway, so it said book sale. So I said to my partner at the time, I said, "Oh, I want to go to this book sale." She said, "Fine." So we went over there, and it's an antiquarian bookstore, and everything's 50% off. Now, I'm in the medical section, and there's these large leather-bound books, and it's like Eclectic Practice of Medicine. I didn't know what that was. But I pulled the book down, I looked through it, and I realized this book is all about herbs. I had no idea who these eclectic people were. And I pulled all these books off the shelf, and they were all marked $50 or $75, which at half off meant they were $25 or $37.50. At the time, for me, that was a lot of money. And I spent everything that I had. I think on the bus ride home, I had these two giant paper, double paper bags with the handles full of books. And I think I had a quarter left and my bus ticket home. That was about it. And I had these books. And I brought them home and I start reading them. And these aren't novels. This is, medical books. But I was absolutely fascinated. And what I discovered there were these people who were medical doctors. These weren't herbalists. These were medical doctors who were basically herbal practitioners. At the time, this would have been about 1975. My assumption, these books had all been published. The ones that I bought then were all from the 1860s, late 1850s to early 1860s. And so I assumed that these eclectics had they had become extinct as a medical group. The irony of it is, and I wish I had known this at the time, in my collection of books, I have a pamphlet from the last time that the American Eclectic Medical Association met as a group that I'm aware of, and it was the 1964 World's Fair in New York. I was there. Now, I was a kid, and I wouldn't have been interested in talking to some old doctor at that time. But if I had realized in 1975 that there might still have been some living eclectics, there actually might have been one or two or three left. By the time I understood enough to realize that, it was well into the late 80s. And at that point, they probably all would have been extinct because the last eclectics practicing medicine graduated in 1939. And there weren't very many that graduated then. Most of them, the last eclectic school pretty much shut its doors in 1936. So the history of the eclectics is absolutely fascinating, at least to me. And I like history, and especially the history of herbal medicine. I'm an herbalist. So that to know the history, to know whose shoulders you are standing upon, whose work we are standing upon, where this information came from, I think is absolutely vital. And so I'll give you just a really brief, and we can go into details if you want to, but a brief sort of outline of the history of herbal medicine here in the United States. So, or first, of course, you have various native nations, and they are practicing their own forms of herbal medicine. And by the time the Europeans get here, there's at least 500 nations, and they all have their own unique herbal practices. They have, and of course, herbs are a major part of their tradition. The Europeans come over, and initially there's pretty decent relationships with the native people and the Europeans until the native folks realize that these folks are not just visiting, and realize that they have this idea and this concept of ownership of land, and more of them just keep coming. Anyway, so some of their knowledge, that knowledge gets passed on and passed over to the European people who've come over. Plus, of course, they bring their own knowledge with them from England, from the Dutch, the Norse, and I'm not talking about the ancient Norse, but there were colonies from Sweden in New Jersey. They were some of the first colonies in the United States, were actually Swedish folks in southern New Jersey. And so they bring their knowledge with them, plus they bring some of their plants with them. So there's plants today like plantain that everybody knows, that plant I talked about before. Well, it's not a native plant. It's an introduced species. And supposedly, of course, one of the common names was white man's foot, because wherever the white people went, the plant kind of tagged along. So there were plants they both brought intentionally because they wanted to grow them for food or for medicine, and then other things that came more accidentally that, again, became naturalized and now grow all over the United States. Medicine, as it's practiced in the early colonies, is basically, for the most part, British traditional, not really even traditional, it's British medicine. And the medicine of those days is what I like to call the Purgam, Pucum, and Bleedum school of medicine. It's incredibly heroic. The idea is that the blood becomes tainted. The more you can get rid of these miasms, these taints in the blood, the better. So they're bleeding people, they're leeching people, they're blistering people, and then they're giving people large amounts of heavy metals and purgatives, and really extreme purgatives like colocynth and jalap. There are cases in the literature where people were given jalap to the point they evacuated their own bowels. I mean, we're talking about, horribly heroic medicine. And it was expensive. There weren't that many doctors here. So most people tried to work on their own, and you had local people who became knowledgeable about herbs. And the first herbal movement in the United States is based on the work of a man named Samuel Thompson, and he creates what's called Thomsonian medicine. And Thompson was more than a bit of a character. He grew up on a really poor farm in New Hampshire. His father wanted him to take over the farm. He did not want to be a farmer. He studied with a widow woman named Mrs. Beaton or Mrs. Benton. I've seen it written both ways, and learned from her. When he was a kid, one of his favorite tricks, he learned this plant from her that she called pukeweed, which is lobelia, and he would get the other kids in the neighborhood to eat it. And his idea of a good time was getting the other kids to eat it and watching them throw up. So that tells you a little bit about his personality. Anyway, at the time, his daughter gets sick. And I don't remember right now if it was yellow fever or typhus, probably typhus. And they call in a local doctor. He charges them a lot of money, and she dies. And Thompson is heartbroken. He is angry, and he is frustrated because he thinks to himself, I could have done better than this. And so he starts to create his own system of medicine. And it's pretty simplistic. It's an energetic system on the simplest level. Heat is life, cold is death. That's it. That's the basic phenomenology of Thomsonian medicine. And he's not using a large number of herbs, maybe 30 or 40. It's still fairly heroic. He's not blistering people, but he does sweat baths with people. He certainly still purges people, although not as nasty substances as the regular doctors are using. And eventually, in 1917, he publishes a pamphlet, and then in 1820, in 1817, he publishes a pamphlet. In around 1820, he publishes his first book, Thomsonian Practice of Medicine, and it becomes a phenomenon. At one point, it's estimated that about a third of the people in the United States were followers of Samuel Thomson. So that's about 30% of the entire population is practicing Thomsonian medicine. He had a profound anti-intellectual bias as far as he was concerned. If you knew how to read and do basic mathematics, the only further education you needed was to read his book. That was it. That was it. All this some knowledge, medical knowledge that anyone needed to know was in his book. Just a little ego there, I suspect. Anyway, over time, Thomson works with a lot of people, and he has fallings out with everybody he works with, which I think says a lot about his personality. He was pretty dictatorial. He, again, had this profound anti-intellectual bias. He didn't, if you wanted to, in order to practice his system, you had to buy a patent from him, and it was cost $20. This is in the 1820s. $20 is a lot of money. But if a doctor wanted to buy a patent from him to practice his system, it cost $100. He didn't actually want doctors doing it. And he had people he worked with who wanted to create schools. He was totally against that. As this schism develops, another group splits off from Thomson, and these are the people who eventually become what are known as the physiomedicalists. Meanwhile, in New York City, there is a man named Wooster Beach. And with a name like Wooster Beach, he had to be good. And so Wooster, he's really, he sees medicine as it's being practiced in that day and age, and he's not impressed. And he hears about this herb doctor living in New Jersey. And he decides he wants to go meet this guy and study with him. And and of course, this meant, he had to take a ferry to New Jersey, stagecoaches, walking. And this doctor is in a town near what today is currently White House Junction, New Jersey. It's down in, I think it's part of Hunterdon County. So central western New Jersey. And he shows up the guy's name is Dr. Jacob Tidd. He's German. And he shows up at his door and he goes, and Tidd opens the door and goes, "What?" And Beach introduces himself and he says, "I'm here to learn from you." And Beach is dressed in his fancy city clothing, and Tidd looks him up and down and slams the door in his face. He says, "Go away, city boy." Well, if nothing else, Beach was stubborn and he kept coming back. And at this point, Tidd is getting older. It's getting harder for him to go out and gather his own medicines. He has no apprentice. And finally, he gives in and teaches Beach everything he knows. And Beach stays with him, I don't know, for a period of a year or two. Beach goes back to New York City, and he decides he wants to start teaching people about this herbal medicine. The only problem is New York had very stringent medical licensing laws. And he realizes if he does this, he's going to get thrown in jail. So what he does is he goes to medical school, regular medical school. And in those days, it was a year of lectures, and it wasn't really a year. It was 6 months of lectures. And then the following year, you'd apprentice for like a year with a practicing doctor. He does this. So now he's an MD. but he also knows herbs. And he creates his clinic in New York in 1825. And that's doing okay. And he's trying to get a school charter to open up a school of what he calls the reform practice of medicine, or the American practice of medicine. But he can't get a charter in New York State. New York State is one of the hotbeds of orthodoxy for medicine in the United States. Philadelphia, New York, Boston. And he can't get one. So eventually, he gets a charter from a defunct literary academy in Ohio. And he sends his trusty lieutenant, Thomas Van Morrow, out to Worthington, Ohio, to create the first school of what becomes eclectic medicine. They don't take on the name Eclectics until around 1840. And the concept of the name was, there were lots of sectarian systems of medicine at the time. You had homeopathy, you had hydrotherapy, you had these different sects. You had the physiomedicalists, who again weren't called physiomedicalists at that time. They'd spent 2 decades trying to figure out their name. But what he wants to do is create this system of medicine based primarily on American materia medica of plants that is, for the most part, safe, less heroic, and effective. And that's how the Eclectics start. And I mean, there's lots of other stories. Their history is, some of it is actually hysterically funny. Like the time there was a fight at the school between 2 different rival groups, and one group had a cannon. It gets really weird. But eventually they have to leave Worthington because they've been stealing bodies from the local paupers cemetery for anatomy practice. And the local folks find out and run them out of town, basically at gunpoint. And they relocate to Cincinnati, which becomes the sort of heart of the eclectic medical movement in America. So that's sort of a very quick, brief intro to sort of American botanical medicine and the Eclectics. And the Eclectics from the get-go were always about being medical doctors who primarily use herbs.
A lot of interesting characters in the scene at the time. I'm curious about the eclectic philosophy and the prevailing philosophies on medicine at the time. A lot of us in herbalism work from a vitalistic perspective, and many of, or most of the traditions I'm familiar with also come from that. So, an idea that there is a vital spark of life, something within us tending towards health when given the right conditions. And was that similar? Did the Eclectics have that? Was that a common perspective in all of medicine at that time? Because I know things have changed since.
It was at the time what were called, they were called the regulars. That's the orthodox medical doctors, or the allopaths. The idea of vis medicatrix natura, or the healing power of nature, was not a part of their practice. It certainly was a part of the Eclectics. It was even more a part of the physiomedicalists, and sort of that whole sort of vitalist tradition that we hear today. Mostly that's coming from the physiomedicalists, that whole sort of idea of vitalism. Granted, it's in other traditions, although that they don't generally use that term. So the philosophy of the Eclectics, first off, their name, they choose the name Eclectic because, unlike these other medical sects that have a theory and they are really kind of rigid about practicing, so the allopaths are really about getting rid of, again, by bleeding, leeching, bloodletting, doing plasters, and evacuating the bowels, making people sweat, making people salivate. That's like what calomel, which is a mercury compound, made people salivate profusely. The idea was you were getting rid of all these bad humors and that would hopefully help the person to get well. So I guess there's sort of a vitalistic concept there, except that, they were actually poisoning people and not really helping them at all. The eclectics, the name eclectic comes from the fact that the eclectics did at that point have a foundational philosophy, except they wanted to be less heroic. They were primarily focused in, not exclusively, but primarily focused in on American medicinal plants. And they were eclectic in the sense that if the homeopaths had a good idea, they'd steal it. If a physiomedicalist had a good idea, they'd borrow it. If the allopathic doctors had a good idea, they'd appropriate it. And all these other groups hated the eclectics because they felt like they were taking their best ideas and, sort of not, it was like, who are these people to just take our stuff? But that was the eclectic philosophy, is to be eclectic, whatever works. And there was no great, beyond that, really underlying philosophy. So the first golden age of the eclectics occurs from around 1855 or maybe 1853 or 4 up until about 1860, 62, 3. And several things almost destroy the eclectics. And a big one is the Civil War. The eclectics were really strong in the South. And during the Civil War, most of their schools, though, were in the North. And so they couldn't get students anymore. And of course, anybody who had been a student is probably fighting in the war. There were other problems as well. That was only one issue. The Civil War was one issue. And the eclectics basically almost collapse. And out of that collapse, a really important man named Dr. John Milton Scudder almost single-handedly resurrects the eclectics. He resurrects the Eclectic Medical College, which is their flagship school in Cincinnati. He resurrects the Eclectic Medical Journal, which is their flagship journal, although at one point there was at least, during their heyday in the 1880s and 90s, there were probably close to a dozen eclectic medical type journals from different states and places. And he creates this new practice of eclectic medicine called specific medication. And specific medication very much has a philosophy. And I'll read you, this is what Scudder wrote. These are the major tenets of specific medication. Disease is to be regarded as an impairment of the life of the creature. It may be of the structure in and by which he or she lives, or of the forces that give life, but it is the life that is to be regarded in medicine. So very, very much vitalist at that point. Number 2, disease has distinct expressions, as has health, and they may be recognized by those who train themselves to undertake accurate observation. The expression language of disease is not a poetic illusion, but a statement of fact. Number 3, there are certain forces in nature locked up in the substances called medicines that act directly upon a living body, enabling it to resist disease and aiding in a restoration of normal function and structures. Number 4, the action of such substances has been determined by observation in the past and is being further known by experiments and observation of the present. Even now, our knowledge of the power of drugs is sufficient to enable us to apply them with a certainty in a very large number of diseased conditions. 5th, we have proven that special drugs meet special conditions of disease. As these conditions of disease have distinct expressions and may be recognized by the physician, we say that these disease expressions become drug indications. And lastly, if these drug indications be followed, the action of remedies will be certain and curative, and the practice of medicine will have a scientific basis which will ensure continued improvement year by year. And so what he creates, the specific medication and specific diagnosis, allows people to treat the specific person, not the disease. And one of the things that I do to this very day, like in my 2-year herb studies program, in the first class, I'll say, how many of you want to be great herbalists? No, excuse me, I blew it. How many of you want to be good herbalists? And everybody raises their hand. And I say, wrong answer. If you're going to be an herbalist, but this is true about anything, if you're going to be a teacher, if you're going to be a doctor, if you're going to be a car mechanic, Don't be content to just be good. Do your best to be great. Not that, you shouldn't be walking around going, oh, I'm so great. That's just pure ego. But the idea of constantly striving to do your best and continue to learn and to grow your skills and your ability to help people should be an ongoing process. And so Scudder basically realizes that in order to treat the person, not the disease, and in my opinion, in order to be a great herbalist, there are at least three things besides sort of what I'll call soft skills: learning how to listen, not just what people say, but how they say it and their body language and all that. Learning to be compassionate, learning to keep a certain objectivity. But beyond those skills, you need to learn herbal energetics, human energetics, which is differential diagnosis, and understand synergy. And so the eclectics create this practice where they're using pulse and tongue diagnosis, except unlike Chinese medicine, where the tongue and the pulse tell you about the underlying pattern, for the eclectics, it tells you the remedy. You've got the aconite tongue, you've got the gelsemium tongue, you've got the, Dioscorea tongue. And the pulses, they indicate certain remedies, and they create what they call specific indications, which is like a short little word picture that describes where a remedy is appropriate in a given situation. So like for instance, Baptisia wild indigo, which is an incredibly useful herb, although it's a very low dose herb and can be quite unpleasant if you take more than the recommended dose. And Baptisia is used for tissue that smells and looks like rotting meat. It's used for necrosis. It is also used for evacuations of the bowels that look like prune juice or the washings of meat. So it's used for things like Crohn's disease. And it is also used both topically and orally for things like putrid sore throat, where you have the pus sacs on the tonsils, or purulent otitis media, or it can be used for septicemia. And it's just this brilliant remedy. It's not used by itself. It's almost always used with Echinacea angustifolia, and the two together, along with maybe a third herb, plantain, for things like venomous snake bites, or even better, brown recluse spider bites, is astonishingly good. And so it gives you these little word pictures that say this remedy can be used for this specific, and if that person has that pattern, then it tells you, in fact, that herb is going to be a benefit for that person. So, for instance, as herbalists, a lot of people think that herbal medicine is not that good for pain because we don't have a lot of big guns for pain. Most of the big guns are either too toxic or illegal for us to use. But what they don't understand is herbal medicine can be phenomenal for pain, but you have to figure out two things. And this is, I get, of course, from the eclectics. One, where is the pain? Genitourinary pain, uterine pain, neck pain. If it's a headache, where in the head is it occurring? So number one, you have to figure out where the pain is. And then number two, real important question, is what does the pain feel like? And I don't mean like when you go to the doctor and say, well, what's the pain feel like on a scale of 1 to 10? What they're talking about is intensity. I don't actually care about that for the most part. What I want to know is the pain burning, stabbing, throbbing, tearing. I want a descriptor of the pain, and each one of those words, depending on which organ or tissue it's in, points to a different herb. And when you use herbs that way for treating pain, your ability to effectively treat pain increases exponentially.
Yeah, that's something so beautiful in a lot of these holistic traditions, and the specific indications help with that. But we're looking at the quality of the experience, right? And the texture of the experience. And that adds so much complexity that can make it more difficult to, not more difficult, but because I'd say treating something and not having it resolve is the more difficult option, but can make it more complex in figuring out a treatment process. However, it when you get that right, when you figure it out, it leads to true resolution, right? Which is so, it's a perspective that is not as common as it once was or has been at certain times, which brings me to another question about the eclectic. So it sounds like it was John Scudder kind of revitalized eclectic
Mhm.
medicine at this point. I think you said the
That's
1860s.
1870. His book Specific Medication comes out in 1870, and his book Specific Diagnosis comes out in 1873.
Okay.
And
And then
go
it
ahead.
kind of dropped off again, though, right? In the, was it the 1930s when the school closed?
Well, Scudder introduces specific medication, and this ushers in the second golden age of eclectic medicine, which lasts from about 1875 through about 1900. And I mean, in the 1890s, eclectic medicine, the future looks bright. There are more, one out of every 9 physicians in the United States is an eclectic in the 1890s. The literature is voluminous. I mean, in my library here, I have stacks after stacks just of eclectic journals and eclectic literature. I mean, they write extensively. There are a number of other people who work with Scudder. He's not doing this alone. You have Finley Ellingwood, who's one of the great eclectics. You have Harvey Wicks Felter, who with John Uri Lloyd writes King's Dispensatory. They take it over from John King, who was one of the original eclectics who worked with Worcester Beach. You have people like what's the guy? You have he's from Georgia, IGM Goss, who's the great Southern eclectic. He's in Georgia. You have Henry Webster in California, who's the great California eclectic. And all these people are producing, and lots of people have seen online. You can get online, you have Ellingwood, you have Felter, you have King and Lloyd and Felter's King Dispensary online. That's the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more eclectic literature. And, for 20 some odd years, they are producing all these incredible books. And that actually continues into the 1910s and even up until around 1922. But what happens is two things, three things, or even four. So one thing that happens is the allopaths start to moderate their practice of medicine. Going to, there was a period of time where going to an MD, a regular MD, you were taking your life in their hand. You're putting your life in their hands. I mean, there were many times where, if the disease didn't kill you, they did. And over the 1860s and 70s, they start to become less heroic. Surgery becomes better. Less people are dying from it. They start recognizing the importance of sanitation. In surgery, little things like washing hands, they start, understanding that. Semmelweis is the one who initially tells everybody you need to, asepsis. And it's also a new turn of the century. And all of a sudden, out of Germany, there's this whole new class of pharmaceutical medications made from aniline coal tar dyes. And all of a sudden, it's kind of like the future. People are looking and thinking, this new century, the eclectics look quaint and old-fashioned. And modern medicine, more and more, is now looking at the laboratory as the source of clean and, scientific medicine. And so, number one, they start sort of losing the public interest. And the eclectics were always strongest in rural areas. And the rural population is decreasing. The population of cities is increasing. You also have in 1907 a really important piece of work called the Flexner Report, which is basically was funded by, I believe, Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundation money. And you also have the joining of the AMA and to some degree with the pharmaceutical industry. They start channeling money to the AMA. The AMA was not a powerful organization until all of a sudden they had a lot of money. And that all comes from the pharmaceutical industry. So for multiple reasons, oh, and then most of the really important eclectics die in the 1890s. Scudder dies, King dies, a whole bunch of other really, prestigious eclectic physicians die in the 1890s. There are some people who certainly carry it on, but they were sort of some of the sort of guiding lights who were really important in the movement. And so for all of those reasons, after the Flexner Report in 1907, they grade every medical school in the United States. And every eclectic school is graded as being deficient. Every physiomedical school is graded as being deficient. Every homeopathic school is graded as being deficient. In some cases, it's because they were, and in other cases, it may have been more political. Also, they didn't have the money that places like Johns Hopkins or Harvard or Yale had. And also, the eclectics were really resistant to a couple of new trends in medicine, like bacteriology. And so, again, they were seen as kind of being backward and not up to date. And so the eclectics started losing people. People no longer were like, oh, no, I don't want to be one of those guys. I want to be a real doctor. And basically, most of the eclectic schools close. The only one that continues to operate is the Eclectic Medical College in Cincinnati. And as I said, they limped along until 1936. They stopped taking students, and the last class finally graduates in 1939. And from there, it's just basically an off the cliff line, to extinction. But and in fact, the irony is the eclectic medical stuff from the 1930s. There is stuff from the 30s and 40s. It is so rare because so little of it was published that's harder to find than stuff from the 1870s or 1880s or whatever. But that's sort of what happens to the eclectics. And, there's a new era. And the homeopaths disappear for the most part. The eclectics disappear. The physiomedicalists disappear, and they disappear quicker because there were many fewer physiomedicalists than there were eclectics. And they kind of disappear. They fall off the face of the earth until they're rediscovered by the American herbal renaissance, a small number of us who basically in the 1970s, mixing up my centuries, in the 1970s and 80s, rediscover the eclectics. And we rediscover the Lloyd Library in Cincinnati, which is the greatest library in the world of botanical medicine, founded by John Uri Lloyd and his brothers, who were part of the eclectic movement. They had the Lloyd brothers, which was probably made the greatest botanical medicines that have ever been made. And the library is still there, and it's remarkable. And I discovered the Lloyd Library in like 1986, maybe. And I go to the Lloyd Library in Cincinnati, and they had a little book to sign in. And the last person who had been there before me was a high school student who had been there the month before and was looking up information on the state flower of Ohio for a school project. Nobody knew it was there. And now, of course, they're actually doing rather well. They've been rediscovered. But, that repository of all that knowledge and all that wisdom has been there all this time.
I'll put that on my list for upcoming field trips for sure.
There's going to be the next International Herb Symposium in September. Will be at the Lloyd Library.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah, definitely. If you have the opportunity, you might want to go. It's worth the visit.
It's not too. I'm near Toronto, so it's not actually that far either for me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to know, I'm sure there's a few, because of the way that the eclectics were working with the specific indications, and we have different common issues coming up health-wise, depending on the time. What were some of the most commonly used herbs that have shown up, or if there are some that stand out from those times?
Well, interestingly enough, when Scudder creates his specific medication, it doesn't get rid of the 50 years of previous experience. So that kind of stuff just gets rolled in. One of the things about eclectic specific medication that is really atypical, when we look at all the great world's herbal traditions, TCM, Ayurveda, Unani Tib, Campo, Siddha, Tibetan medicine, physiomedicalism, they all use complex formulas. The eclectics, on the other hand, are using individual remedies, which is almost unknown in any other tradition of herbal medicine. Even though the earlier eclectics are using complex formulas, and that, of course, continues. And when you read the eclectic literature, you would think that they're using one herb at a time. But then when you read it really closely, you start reading about what are called herbal cooperatives. They talk about these herbal cooperatives. And this is similar to, like in Chinese medicine, you have this practice called Duiyao. And Duiyao means two herbs. These are the herb pairs that are the building blocks of all TCM Chinese formulas. And over the millennia in Chinese medicine, and also true in Ayurveda, they recognize that certain herbs in combination work better than the individual herbs. So like Duiyao, in Chinese medicine, you have herbs like Corydalis, Yanhuisua, and you add in a little bit of another herb called Baizhur, Angelica dihurica, and it potentiates the activity of the Corydalis for relieving pain and is antispasmodic, and it really potentiates it significantly. So that's Duiyao. So the eclectics were no different. They recognized that certain herbs work better. So before I mentioned that the combination of Baptisia, wild indigo, with Echinacea angustifolia, and you'll notice I keep saying Echinacea angustifolia, not Echinacea purpurea. Echinacea angustifolia is far superior to Echinacea purpurea. And if you are stuck using purpurea because you can grow it yourself and you don't have access to angustifolia, the trick that you want to understand, our listeners, is you want to make two tinctures of Echinacea purpurea. You make a tincture of the root and you make a tincture of the flower, the cones. The roots contain none of the isobutylamides that are found in Echinacea angustifolia root, the stuff that makes your mouth tingle wildly. But the cones have a fair amount of it. And so you actually make two different tinctures at two different times. Then you blend them together 50-50. And that combination, which is the best product of Echinacea purpurea, is only about 70% as active as Echinacea angustifolia. Anyway, those two together, that's a Duiyao. That's one of those herb pairs. In Ayurveda, they have herb pairs and herb triplets like Triphala, all right, or Trikatu. All right, again, you have these combinations where everything sort of enhances the activity. This is what I was talking earlier about, the things to be a great herbalist, the concept of synergy. This is synergy. And where 1 and 1 no longer equals 2, 1 and 1 equals 3 or 4 or 5. I know one study where adding a second herb to a first herb increased bioavailability by 2,000%. 1 and 1 equals 2,000. And so great herbal medicine is about also not just knowing your herbs and your materia medica, which is vital, but knowing what to mix with what and what not to mix with what. Because just like there's synergy, there's anti-synergy or antagonism, where 1 + 1 equals 1. So understanding how to blend these things together. And so the eclectics, yeah, I mean, some of the herbs that first off, they introduced echinacea into basically Western herbal practice. They introduced fresh oat into Western herbal practice, fresh milky oat. They introduced kava into Western herbal practice. Some of the herbs they were really big on, well, they loved their primary liver herb, two of them. One was Culver's root, Veronicastrum, which hardly anybody uses today. It's great medicine. And the other one is Cyananthus, fringe tree. Those were their probably two most popular liver herbs. And I would still be using Chionanthus if I could get it. The problem is in the wild, it's just really hard to find. And it would really require somebody to have a fringe tree plantation to make it doable, because the part used is the root bark. And even though I know of at least one company that's producing fringe tree from the stem bark, there's no history of using that at all. So you cannot assume, because the root bark work does this, that the stem bark will do the same thing. That got us into trouble with kava when they started using the stem peelings instead of the root, and then people started to develop hepatotoxicity because there was stuff in the stem bark that wasn't in the root bark. Anyway, other things, the eclectics, they were big fans of Dioscorea, wild yam. And I have to say that wild yam, in my opinion, is one of the most misunderstood herbs. You hear all these stories. Wild yam can increase contains natural progesterone. No, it doesn't. Wild yam stimulates production of progesterone. No, it doesn't. Wild yam contains natural DHEA. No, it doesn't. Wild yam stimulates production of DHEA. No, it doesn't. Wild yam can be used for birth control. Well, you could make birth control pills out of wild yam in a laboratory through an 11-step process, but it has no benefit as birth control unless you can make protective barrier around yourself using wild yam root. What wild yam is used for, the specific indications for wild yam is bilious colic. And so this is for the person who eats fats and gets Pepto-Bismol. You become bilious, queasy, nauseous with flatulent colic, with painful gas. That's where wild yam shines. That's where it really is. It's primarily a liver and intestinal remedy. Another eclectic remedy that's not well known, it was very popular, was Collinsonia, also known as horsebalm, richweed, and it grows up by you for sure. It grows here, grows well up into Canada. And the eclectics were really clear that what you wanted, the medicine had to be aromatic Collinsonia. What is aromatic Collinsonia? Meaning most people who use Collinsonia use it for hemorrhoids, and they use the dried root. Well, the eclectics were really clear. First of all, you need the entire fresh plant. That's the aromatic Collinsonia. So you want the leaves, the flowers, the stems, and the roots, made not from the dry plant, but from the fresh plant. When you dry it, you lose a lot of activity. And aromatic Collinsonia is indicated for tissue that is boggy, atonic, with a tendency to oversecrete or bleed. So it is used for minister's throat. Some of you might remember many American presidents ago, not that you want to think about American, Bill Clinton used to always have this hoarse voice from speaking all the time. And that's what's called minister's throat. This is that chronic low-grade irritation of your vocal cords you get from either singing or talking a lot. And Collinsonia is wonderful for that. It's also used for benign prostatic hyperplasia. It's also used for cardiac hypertrophy with mild mitral valve prolapse. Again, the tissue is boggy, atonic. It's used for allergic rhinitis, where there's oversecretion, and and hemorrhoids and varicose veins and spider veins. And so that was a really prominent eclectic remedy. Now, I also, though, do have to mention the eclectics liked to use a lot of really toxic herbs. Now, they used them in really minute quantities, not homeopathic. They weren't homeopaths, although Scudder was influenced by Hahnemann's work in creating specific medication. It wasn't his only area of influence. Rademacher's work also influenced him, and other things. But they were using very small doses of things like aconite and gelsemium and belladonna and veratrum, and those were pretty popular. And some of them are safe enough for a well-trained herbalist to use. Certainly belladonna or aconite or gelsemium, somebody who's trained and understands the toxicology of those plants can use them, again, in very small doses as a part of a much larger formula. Those are all herbs that no one should be self-medicating themselves with. And the good news is you can't go into a health food store and buy those. They're not generally available. But the Eclectics used a lot of them. And some of the herbs they used, like veratrum, which is so erratic that I don't work with it, or things like Nux vomica, which is a source of strychnine, they're even things that I don't even feel comfortable working with. I know people do. And there's always somebody who's like really attracted to the really toxic stuff, the low dose botanicals. It's like the beauty of it is, I mean, in my 2-year herb studies program, my students learn about 300 plants in exquisite detail. They used to call the Eclectics materia medica mad. I guess yeah. If the label fits, so am I, because I want people to understand that there's all these subtle differences between medicines, and sometimes if you have nothing else, you fit the person to the medicine you have, but it's much better to fit the medicine to the person, and you get much better results, much more specificity, and so I think it is really important to know your materia medica and know it really well, and know what I call the personality of the plant. And the personality is not just the chemistry. It's not just the primary and secondary uses or the dose form. It's also the energetics. It's also the subtle differences that say, absolutely want to use this one for this person. There's two, you have 2 or 3 choices, but one of them's so much better. Or these 2 together are so much better than using either one alone. And just getting to understand materia medica on that level. And you talked about it before about, the complexity. Yeah, it's complex. I mean, it doesn't always have to be so complex. You have a tummy ache, I could give you some ginger. And if it helps, fantastic. On the other hand, if you come back tomorrow with a tummy ache and I give you more ginger and it helps, but then you come back the next day with a tummy ache, then it's a Band-Aid. And I'm not really getting to the real issue. And so there's certainly, you can use herbs on a first aid level, on a simple level for, self-limiting conditions. But then if you're serious and people have serious issues, then it does become more complex. But that's the beauty of becoming an herbalist, is really learning and understanding the complexity of human beings, the emotional, spiritual, physical complexity, and how to match the herbs to the specific person sitting in front of you rather than the disease. So you hear all these sound bites of information. St. John's wort's the depression herb, and black cohosh is the menopause herb, and saw palmetto is the prostate herb. And the only problem with each thing I just said is they are wrong, and wrong. They're not true. Saw palmetto is not that great for benign prostatic hyperplasia. But if you use it with some nettle root and some aromatic collinsonia and maybe some white sage, now you're talking. Or black cohosh is not impressive for menopausal symptomology. Most of the women who take it go, I don't know, maybe I had like 1 less hot flash a day, or maybe they were slightly better, but, I didn't really notice that much for most women. But you take that black cohosh and you add in some chaste tree. If I had to choose one herb for menopausal symptomology, it'd be chaste tree, not black cohosh. But black cohosh and chaste tree together work better than either one alone. And then you add in a little bit of maybe some motherwort or night blooming cereus and a little hint of licorice and a little bit of sage. Now you're talking about really significant reduction in menopausal symptomology, both physiological and psychological symptoms. And then I would just mention St. John's wort is quote unquote depression herb. Of the more than 14 subtypes of depression that I teach, St. John's wort only works well for 3 of them. And so again, you need to know the person who's depressed, not just that they're depressed. Why are they depressed? What's going on? Is it due to neuroinflammation, gut inflammation, GI dysbiosis, blood sugar dysregulation, cardiac issues, thyroid dysfunction? All of these things can lead to depression, but the herbs used to treat them are entirely different. And the Eclectics really emphasize this kind of thing. I mean, they don't get into energetics like I do, because what I do is not purely, I studied TCM, I've studied Southeastern herbal traditions, I've, eclectic medicine, and I sort of have created my own system based on all that. But the eclectics were great heroes of mine and incredible influences. And if we had a second, can I tell you about my favorite eclectic?
Yeah.
The most eclectic of the eclectics? And his name was Eli G. Jones. And Eli Jones was a really interesting character. And he had the requisite beard. Because all the eclectics are what I like to call my PowerPoint when I do the history of American herbal medicine, guys with beards. They have all got these crazy beards. Well, mine's not crazy. It's just a little. Anyway, Jones is trained originally as a allopathic physician. And he graduates medical school and he practices for a couple years and he's totally dissatisfied. He is like, I'm not being able to help people. So he knows about these other traditions. So he goes to Eclectic Medical College. And after graduating from one of the Eclectic medical schools, he practices as an eclectic for like 5 years. Then he says to himself, well, that's good. I'm able to do much more now. But, there's these other traditions. What do they know that I don't know? So then he goes to a physiomedicalist school and then practices physiomedicalist medicine for like 5 years. Then he goes to a homeopathic school and does that for 5 years. And then he studies Schussler cell salts and does that. And after this like 25-year experiment, he puts it all together and creates his own system called Definite Medication. And he wrote 2 books. One's called Definite Medication, and they're available as reprints. And the other one is called Cancer. It's Causes, Symptoms, and Treatment or something like that. And this guy, of any eclectic, he is the most eclectic because he was willing to do anything if it would help his patients. And his books, I must say, are well worth reading. They truly are. So to some degree, he's one of my heroes because he didn't let any type of philosophical belief get in his way of helping his patients. It's like, where can I learn new things? How can I do a better job to be the best physician that I can be to make the best, difference in my patient's life? And what a thing to, try to achieve in one's life. And my God, look how much time. When he would go back to school, he didn't have to spend as much time. He had already done all the prerequisites. So he probably, each case, it was no more than a year of just learning that, homeopathic medicine. He didn't have to learn basic medicine, but still it was a remarkable life.
Yeah, that perspective the eclectics had as well that you just mentioned of what is going to help this person in front of me that is asking for guidance, in my mind, should be foundational for anyone doing this type of work. And we may not be able to train in every modality, but the more awareness we can have and know when to look for outside tools, things that we don't have access to, that does ethically seem to be should be a part of all herbalist practice. So, and I see, David, also it looks like maybe you are an eclectic exactly in that way, carrying on that tradition. And that's what it sounds like to me.
I guess you're right. I don't think I'd ever thought about that before, but I think you're actually correct. Because, one of the things I tell my students is I don't believe in sacred cows. And so you want to look at what are your beliefs that are going to get in the way of you helping people. And there are things that I don't believe work. But if a patient comes to me or a student comes to me and says, I'm working with these people and I'm using this technique, and I'm thinking, oh, that doesn't work, and then I'm having great results. Okay. I always tell my students, don't argue with success. If it's working, fantastic. I'm no homeopath. I know way more about homeopathy than the average person, for sure. And I got to spend some time with one of the last of the great New York homeopaths, Dr. John Stevenson, back in the 70s. He was remarkable. And one day he turns to me and he says, so, You want to be an herbalist or a homeopath? And I'm looking at him going, well, I was kind of thinking of doing both. And he just shakes his head. He says, no. He says, you want to be a homeopath. He says, you do what I do every day for the next 20 years and you will be competent. And I was like, all right, I'll stick with herbs. I still don't even know if I believe in homeopathy. I mean, I've seen it do miracles and I've seen it fail miserably. It's an interesting phenomenon. And I know some of like the top homeopaths in North America. So I'm still shake my head sometimes and don't quite understand it. And that just could be my ignorance speaking. But with herbal medicine, if you figure out what's happening, if you understand the person and the underlying pathophysiology of what is occurring, it is exceedingly rare that you're not going to see some improvement. And when, I was talking before about treating depression, when you look at, again, these 14 subtypes of depression, when you do that, the results you get, if you give people St. John's wort, clinical trials show St. John's wort, just, giving in somebody's depressed with mild to moderate depression, works as well as an SSRI or an SNRI. It works about 40% of the time, which is good for those 40% of people, but it's not terribly impressive. I mean, active placebo has been shown to work 33% of the time. So it's like, say 7% better than placebo. But when you treat people based on their underlying type of depression using the appropriate herbs, I was saying, no, I don't have any clinical trials to back this up, but I have 49 years of clinical experience and patients. I would say easily with my patients who have mild to moderate depression, at least 65 to 70% of them respond really well. Now, I'd like it to be 80 or 90%, and hopefully eventually, if you figure things out, you get to a higher percentage point. But just the difference between 40 and 65 to 70 is pretty darn significant. And that's because we're treating the person who's depressed, not depression. Depression as a generic phenomenon, that's just, in my opinion, that's not good herbal medicine. Don't treat diseases, treat people.
Same way as you said, understanding these plants, if we look at people that we know, especially those we've known a long time, and you see complexity and nuance and paradox within them and their personality and who they are. And it's such richness. And the plants all have this richness too, that we have to work to understand. But yeah, it definitely gives us access to so much more when it comes to using them as medicines, understanding them as personalities and beings that then make it. I know that's changed my practice and how I've been able to help match people to a plant and seen much different results when that. Sometimes you hit it, sometimes you miss it, sometimes you're learning, you're always trying, but when you hit it, you say, yes, I saw that. It's coming together. It's such a great feeling. I wanted to go back just a little bit to something that you said, because I get this question often from students, and it was about, we know about synergy with plants. That's very commonly talked about, but plants that don't actually go well together or play well together. And I'm curious if this is more to do with energetics, or with, obviously there will be sometimes chemistry issues, or is it all of those things? And what are some examples of some of these plants that don't necessarily work well together?
Well, yeah, the whole idea of anti-synergy or antagonism, there's really two phenomena happening there. One of them is basically chemical or pharmacological. So you don't want to, like if you're making a tincture or even a tea, and you've got a plant that is highly mucilaginous, let's say marshmallow, and then you have a plant in there that's full of tannins. The tannins will bind with the mucopolysaccharides, creating what I call a mucosoidal phlegm ball, and it's insoluble. You can't make it go back into solution, and you've ruined your tincture or your tea. And if you didn't leave enough headspace in your bottle when you made the tincture, you filled it to the tippy top, when it does that, it expands, it'll explode your bottle. So don't do that. So you don't want to, that is a pharmacological incompatibility. It also doesn't make sense to put strong sedatives and strong stimulants in the same. I mean, these are kind of what I would call common sense things. Um, Although it seems like common sense turns out to be remarkably rare. But nevertheless, there's certain things that just don't make sense chemically or physiologically. So that's one area. True herb-herb interactions are actually pretty rare. But in Chinese medicine, you have a list, or what are called the 19 incompatibles. These are herbs that just do not work well together. Many of them are fairly toxic herbs and relatively uncommon herbs, so that's good. But I'll give you an example of one, and that is, and you will see this over and over and over again, in formulas on the shelf. You pull off a formula that's supposed to be like, Uretone or something like that, and it's supposed to be for UTIs. And what is in there? Uva ursi and cranberry. That is an herb-herb interaction. Why? Well, uva ursi contains arbutin. And arbutin in alkaline urine, because most UTIs is because of alkaline urine, which allows E. coli to grow. In alkaline urine, that arbutin is broken down into hydroquinone, which is a really good urinary antibacterial. Cranberry acidifies the urine, meaning it's no longer it's less alkaline, so it prevents the arbutin being converted into hydroquinone. So in this case, cranberry actually interferes with the process of the chemical breakdown of the active constituent, being arbutin, into the component compound of hydroquinone. So that's a true herb-herb interaction. There are not a lot of them.
Very interesting. Because they're both often indicated when there is urinary issues, bacterial infections, and things like that. So,
Well, cranberry is really much better for preventing UTIs, but on the other hand, D-mannose, the sugar D-mannose, works even better than cranberry. So if you have somebody who has chronic UTIs, you want to prevent further UTIs, you just have them take D-mannose every day. Works way better than cranberry. And it's not an herb. See, you can be eclectic. It's whatever works.
although some would say, I mean, yeah, that's it. Whatever works. Would you say that's one of the best lessons from the Eclectics?
I think that's certainly a really good lesson from the Eclectics. I also think, of course, the idea of specificity, of really getting to know each herb well enough that you can create these word pictures to kind of tell you where it's indicated. Because again, you often see these, you'll often see books, not just popular books, but sometimes even, supposedly clinically oriented books. And they just kind of like, they'll have an herb and they'll say, it's good for this, 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 and this. And they're not telling you enough to know, is it really good for that? So let's talk about, for a second, let's talk about migraines. And on the most simplistic level, we can divide migraines into two categories. It's more complicated than that. But on the simplistic level, we can divide migraines into deficiency cold migraines or excess heat migraines. And the herbs we use to treat one are entirely different than the herbs we use to treat the other. And so the Eclectics give us a sense of specificity to our materia medica that I think is really useful. Sadly, and I started off by saying this, I wished I could have met a living eclectic, because there's no way, or at least I've not been able to figure out. I'm sure there's somebody smarter than me that may be able to figure this out. But when you read in their old books about the aconite pulse or the Dioscorea pulse, I don't know what it feels like. And you can't tell from reading about it. The only way you'd know is if you had somebody who actually knew the system and could say, feel that pulse, and you listen to the pulse, that's this pulse. Or you look at the tongue. Sometimes with the tongue, you can kind of figure out, because they would say in their literature, they'd say the tongue is bright red and shiny. And when you saw that bright red shiny tongue, that's the Stellingia tongue. All right. So there's some of the tongue stuff you could figure out, but the pole stuff without somebody actually showing you, that's the unfortunate part, because some of it, most of it, again, the literature is voluminous. So most of it is there for us to explore, to read, to rediscover. And of course, that process has been going on now for probably about 40 years, rediscovering what the eclectics left us, and the physiomedicalists. And and it was an ongoing process, meaning they weren't finished. What they left us was not, it was not like the Bible, which is, the holy word written down. What they left us was a experiment that was about 50 years old. And if they had continued and thrived, at this point, we would have an experiment that is close to 80, would it be, let's say 70s, 30, 100, yeah, 80, 100 and about 50 years of that experience, we would know even more. So to me, it's about picking up their work. And of course, as you said, I also use TCM. I also use these other traditions that I've been trained in, and creating something, and not sitting there saying, okay, we're there. We've achieved everything we need to know. Oh my God. I mean, I'm joking and I'm not joking when I tell people after 56 years, I now feel comfortable calling myself an advanced beginner. Um, do I know a lot? I guess on some levels I do. But at the same time, it's like I know this much of what there is to know. It's endless. And I mean, for those of you who are looking for a clinician, you find a clinician who thinks they know everything, run in the other direction. Just run away, because anybody who thinks that they know everything is seriously dangerous and not a good clinician. It's important to stay humble. It's important to stay open to learning. And that's another lesson the eclectics give us, because it was this constant ongoing process. And they were never content to say, all right, our work is done. We're finished. Never. And so we're still working at it. And they're some of the shoulders that certainly I'm standing on.
Yeah, it's such an interesting perspective shift for that a lot of us have to go through, from growing up and getting this sort of messaging around finding solutions and answers, and that's sort of the end of the road. But yeah, anyone going down the plant path, or a lot of creative paths are similar, anything you're approaching with curiosity and openness, and you do require that with herbs to continue on, to continue learning. I definitely feel the same way. The more I know, the less I know. And also the more curious I become. So it kind of works out. And to think about, like you said, yeah, if we just keep building on what we're discovering, and also our times change and the energetics that are around us on this planet change. So the things that maybe are afflicting us or affecting us are always unique to our time. So there's going to be shifts in how to approach treatment in that way too. It's just an evolving, ongoing practice that it's so rich, exciting, and so grateful there's so many people getting interested again in this. And David, just before we go, thank you so much for continuing on this practice and sharing your wisdom with us. And yeah, so many amazing books. You've got a school. Tell us a little bit about where we can find you, anyone who's looking to learn a little more from you.
All right. Well, my website is herbstudies.net. I think. I don't remember these things. I think it's herbstudies.net. And that's the website for my school, the David Winston Center for Herbal Studies, which offers a introductory 2-year program. This is clinical herbal medicine, meaning this is not an introductory herb program. This is your basic 2 years as a clinician. So people coming in already have to have prerequisites of college level anatomy and physiology. And we have 2 of our teachers offer a class if people don't already have it. And then we offer for people who've done the 2-year program, 2 additional 1-year programs, the graduate program and therapeutics program. And the goal is to teach people to be incredible clinical herbalists. Um, Half of my students are already medical professionals, medical doctors, naturopathic physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners, dentists, lots of veterinarians, especially the last 10, 15 years, tons of veterinarians. Um, and acupuncturists and nutritionists, etc. And the other half are people who are either herbalists who have often been studying for years or decades and just want to decide to take it to the next level, or people who, in some cases, have just become fascinated with herbs and they're looking for a change in their life. They want to literally change their direction. So you can reach me there. I also have an herb company called Herbalist and Alchemist. I The only problem is, of course, most of your listeners, well, not all of them, but many of them are in Canada, and I'm not sure how accessible our stuff is these days getting across the border. And of course, the Canadian dollar, US dollar, that's pricey. There is a company called Emerson that for clinicians that carries a lot of our products, and they may have worked out, an easier way to get things to Canadian practitioners. I have multiple books. My best-selling book is called Adaptogens, Herbs for Strength, Stamina, and Stress Relief. The second edition came out in 2019. And if you have the first edition, I highly recommend you get the second edition. It is 50% of it is rewritten. It's 25% bigger, and all the new research that occurred from 2009 to 2012, which really helped us to understand more about adaptogens, was not in the edition that came out in 2007, but is all in the 2019 edition. And I have other books I've written as well. And then, I teach all over the U.S. and Canada and Europe, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I'm going to be teaching in BC next June at Chan Chow's place, which is always fun and delightful for a conference that'll be there. And I teach actually a fair amount in Canada. I love coming to Canada. Um, as long as Canadians are still willing to have me come.
Always love them.
Some are a little upset with the U.S. at the moment.
Oh,
Incredible,
not the people.
deservedly so.
We understand there's a lot of different and wonderful Americans.
Oh yeah, yeah. There are some. Anyway, so I mean, those are just some of the the places where my work is out there. And if you do go to the website, I would just point out also there's my library, which is the Herbal Therapeutics Research Library, is one of the largest private herbal research libraries in North America. Now, I've started to donate my library to United Plant Savers, and last year I donated the first 1,700 volumes to UPS, but there's still more than 7,000 volumes here from 1550 to current. Eventually, that'll all go to United Plant Savers because, they say you can't take it with you. But there are books from my library in the website that people can just download for free. Things that are, many cases, things that are not widely available elsewhere. I was doing that actively for years. I haven't done anything in a long time. But like we talked about Eli G. Jones. And Eli Jones, for like 2 years, published this little pamphlet called Therapeutic Facts for the Busy Doctor. And I don't think it's anywhere except on my website, because I have it, and so we copied them, and it's there for free. So enjoy.
Great resource. I was just checking this is definitely one of my most grabbed books from my own bookshelf. Just checking that I had the updated
Yeah.
version. I do, yeah. Such a great one. So we'll head off and close up, but there was one thing you mentioned I just thought was really interesting. I'd love to, if you could leave us with a thought on that. You mentioned many of your students are actually more conventional healthcare practitioners at the time. So this is something I've heard from a few different folks I've had the pleasure of getting to have discussions with and I think a lot of us in the herb world with a holistic view are really excited about the idea of reintegrating healthcare and all of those things. So you are seeing that directly, that that interest is there. What do you see for the future of healthcare?
About 10 to 15 years ago, I'm a little weird with time. Anytime I give you a time, it's usually plus or minus 5 years. Um, so let's say, it was more than 10, at least 15 years ago. I was the keynote speaker for a wonderful herb conference in Florida called the Florida Herb Conference that used to be put on by Emily Ruff in the School of Natural Living. Emily's not, she's now up in Vermont with Sage Mountain. Um, and my keynote, I called it, I Have a Dream. And what I started off by saying is, you've heard those words before by somebody far more eloquent than I am, but I have a dream too. And my dream is that I still hope that within my lifetime, there will be a time where almost every mom and dad, grandmother and grandfather knows basic kitchen herbal medicine for their families. I would hope that there'll be a time where there are community herbalists in every community, and there are clinical herbalists available in any clinical setting. And the reason for that is, and I can't speak to Canada because you have a very different healthcare system than we do. Our healthcare system is incredibly dysfunctional and expensive. But here in the US, we have the most expensive healthcare in the world. We spend more per person, per capita, than any country, yet we rank behind every other developed country when it comes to life expectancy, infant mortality, mother mortality, on all the measures of health. We lag far behind not only every developed country, many countries that are considered to be relatively undeveloped countries have better healthcare statistics. The only places where we are near the top is in cancer rates and obesity, which is not a good thing. And money is not the only problem here. It's not just throwing money at a problem. I honestly believe that really well done herbal medicine could be a piece, not the whole thing. It's not the answer to all of our problems, but a piece of creating a sustainable practice of medicine that is much more patient-centered and really improves quality of life. And so for me, it is essential to continue to teach, to share, and to get this information out there, because a lot of people have this idea that it's this battle. And I know there are people who think this way, but I don't think this way. There's this battle between orthodox medicine, or, I'm always weirded out when people call it traditional medicine. No. What we do is traditional medicine. But orthodox medicine or Western medicine, they think there's a competition between Western medicine and, let's say, herbal medicine. And the irony here is that where orthodox medicine is strong is almost exactly where herbal medicine is weak. And the obverse is true. Where herbal medicine is strong is almost exactly where orthodox medicine is weak. And so the two together are much stronger than either one by itself. Yeah, there's some areas that neither one of us do a good job. But the winner, so to speak, in having a great herbalist and a great physician being able to cooperate and to work together is the patient. And so I really hope that, it continues to grow. There is continued interest. I mean, there's also a lot of, pushback. Oh, herbs are dangerous, and all this concern about herb-drug interactions. And I would just leave you with a very simple thing. Herb-drug interactions are absolutely real. There are some serious ones, like St. John's wort with cyclosporin, the anti-transplant rejection drug. There are cases of people think St. John's wort is starting to reject their heart. You know what you say about the heart? Don't leave home without it. I mean, bad. But if you look at the literature carefully, clinically significant herb-drug interactions are really rare. So yes, they exist, and they mostly exist with 7 medications. Not 7. And so there are certain things, like you have somebody on warfarin, because here in the US, we don't see patients on warfarin much anymore. Everybody is on Eliquis. But in Canada and in Europe, people are still commonly using warfarin. Warfarin is like the poster child for interactions, not just herbs, other drugs, foods, cosmetics, cigarettes, alcohol. I mean, warfarin is a nightmare interaction wise. So there are certain medications that you have to be paranoid about, but there's not a lot of them. And when you look at the literature, especially like with chemotherapeutic agents, I only can think of two substances that have been shown to interfere with chemotherapy. One being St. John's wort, not all chemotherapy, but some, and the other EGCG from green tea, which of course is a concentrated extract. The vast majority of the interactions between herbs and chemotherapeutic agents are positive interactions. And in Chinese medicine, there's a whole practice of Chinese medicine called Fuzheng Pai Bun, to restore the normal, which was designed to be used with chemotherapy. And it makes chemotherapy work better. It reduces interactions. It enhances host immune competence. And the results are almost invariably better. And to some degree, it inhibits the MDR, the multiple drug resistant cells in cancer, from becoming resistant to the chemotherapeutic agent. What's not to love there?
I couldn't agree more. And thank you for sharing that dream that is very synergistic and to me sounds very eclectic as well. I love that. Whatever works. So, David, thanks again for joining me on our podcast today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you, Megan. It has been a delight. And what's better than talking about herbs?
Nothing. I know. And I had so many other questions I wanted to ask. We'll have to have you on again to dive into some of the other subjects that you are so knowledgeable in. I would love to do that. So,
Great.
we'll
Well,
host
let's do it. We'll do it again.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.